My name is Col Jonas, and today's talk will be a continuation of what we started yesterday yesterday mainly focused on me and my Air Force career. And today I'm going to focus on the Vietnam War, at least the part that I played in it and some of the other guys. I left a couple of things unsaid yesterday. Remember when I told you about punching out of the F-16? I never got around to telling you what happened to the airplane. What happened was a compressor blade, which is about 3 inches wide and about 6 inches long, came loose out of the fifth compressor stage on the front end of the engine. There's 13 fan wheels on the front end of the engine that pulls the air in and compresses it. Well, at the fifth stage, as I say, it's about 3 by 6 inches, and one of those dudes came loose and went back through that engine and corncobbed it. It weren't going to compress any more air. When the investigation board finished up their work, they offered me some souvenirs. And they gave me the ejection handle, that little yellow one that's down between your legs, the stick, throttle, the clock, and a small placard off the engine that says Pratt & Whitney, reliable engines. I also forgot to say yesterday when I first began that if at any time when I'm up here talking you've got a question, raise your hand and I'll stop and give you a chance to ask the question. And don't hesitate. I love having questions. I want to know what's on your mind too. Well, let's talk about Southeast Asia, and to get ourselves oriented, Colonel Peoples is going to take us on a Google Earth ride from where we are to where this is.
Hey guys, this is America. We'll make sure everybody knows where Vietnam is. Other side of the Pacific Ocean, very famous peninsula out there. And then Col Jonas will be talking about this part of it.
Okay, this is East Asia. There's China. It's slightly larger than the United States by about 10,000 square miles. Mongolia, Philippines down here, Japan, Japanese islands up here, Korea over the south. The island of Taiwan, I spent some time there. And then Indochina, as it was known from before the end of World War II, is composed of 3 countries. Vietnam, the green one, Laos, which is the orange one, and Cambodia, which is the tan colored one down here. In my mind, I always included Thailand as part of Indochina, but it really, technically, was not and is not. At the end of, well, let's go to the next slide. We're going to get a closer up look at the Indo-Chinese Peninsula. At the end of World War II, Vietnam and Indochina reverted back to the control of the French. Actually, during the war, the Vichy French, who was the Frenchmen who were on the bad guys' side, had administration authority over Indochina. But it was occupied by the Japanese, and of course they naturally called the shots. But when the war ended, then each one of these all reverted back to French control. Vietnam itself is a little bit larger than New Mexico, the state of New Mexico. And I got a slide on that. We'll come back to this one later. I think it's the next slide. It's a little bit larger than New Mexico and a little bit smaller than Germany. Another interesting fact about those 3 pieces of real estate is that in Vietnam there's about 80 million people. And just imagine 80 million people on a chunk of real estate the size of New Mexico. New Mexico only has about 2 million people. Germany has about 80 million people. It's really crowded over there. There's no elbow space. After the end of World War II, it was Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And then in 1949, 4 years after the war ended, we can back up that other slide, please. At the end, in 1949 rather, 4 years after the end, Vietnam was split into 2 hunks, North Vietnam and South Vietnam, and it was split at the 19th parallel of latitude here. In the north, there was a group of people called the Viet Minh, spelled like this. And interestingly enough, the guy who was in charge up there, his name was Ho Chi Minh. I don't know if he took his name from the political movement or not, but in any event, they began to fight the French. They wanted the French out of there so that they could control everything that went on in at least in North Vietnam. And finally, in 1954, despite a lot of expensive help from the United States, they kicked the French out. The French had to pack up their bags and leave because they couldn't stand the military pressure. And as soon as that happened, the North Vietnamese began trying to take over South Vietnam. And they did that in a couple of ways. The biggest effort that took place in South Vietnam was by a group of people called the Viet Cong, C-O-N-G. And they were supplied with munitions, people, supplies, and everything else by the North Vietnamese. And before that war ended in 1975, there was a few battles between the regular North Vietnamese army and the Allies who were trying to defend South Vietnam. I'll talk about one or two of those a little bit later. The United States began supplying military training for South Vietnam to help them defend themselves against their unfriendly brethren to the north. At the height of the war, U.S. troops numbered about 500,000 in South Vietnam and elsewhere in Southeast Asia. We have several air bases in South Vietnam. The blue arrows point to places where we had U.S. Air Force assets, and Marine Corps and Navy too, for that matter. Of course, the Navy had some carriers out here in the Gulf of Tonkin. Tan Son Air Base down here by Saigon, the capital city of South Vietnam. Another big base was at Da Nang, further up, just below the demilitarized zone. And I had a lot of buddies that were stationed at Da Nang. Cam Bay, I had some buds that were stationed at Cam Bay also flying the F-4. And there were I think the Marines also had some operations out of Cam. There are several other air bases in South Vietnam, but I just didn't have room to put them all on there. In Thailand, we had about 5 or 6 major air bases. And the one that I was stationed at was Yuban here in southeastern Thailand. That was an F-4 base. Another F-4 base was up here at Udorn in northern Thailand. And then we had 2 bases where they had the F-105 Thunder Chief. That was at Karat, which is right here, and Tak Lee, which is there. And the participation that I had in the air war a lot of the times amounted to what we call the Alpha Day Strike Force. It was a huge mission put together with, usually the typical would be 16 F-105s, that's 4 flights of 4 carrying bombs. They would be in like a box. And then out in front of them would be what we called Iron Hand. And they later changed their name, became known as Wild Weasel. And their mission was to destroy SAM sites, surface-to-air missile sites. And then outrating, yeah, go ahead.
What aircraft served as Wild Weasels?
At first it was the F-105. And then later on the F-4. The F-105s, they got old and rickety, and so they replaced them with F-4s that had the same kind of equipment in them. It was very sensitive electronic equipment, so you could detect the radar radiations from a surface-to-air missile site. That mission is being handled today by the F-16 CD, I think they call it. Mary and I did a show for the troops in the 35th Fighter Wing in Misawa Air Base, Japan last month. And they have 2 squadrons, the 13th and the 14th, and both of them are Wild Weasel squadrons. And when they're in the bar at the old club and somebody proposes a toast, they drink and say, "Weasel!" Okay, and then the rest of the package included escort flights. Usually that mission was flown by the F-4. You'd have like a flight of 4 F-4s out on the right side of the strike force and a flight of 4 F-4s out on the left side of the strike force. The F-105s would be carrying bombs, anywhere from 500 pounds up to 3,000 pound bombs. I want to tell you about a mission that I went on with the F-105s one time where they were carrying what we call 3 Granders, 3,000 pound bombs. There were other airplanes in support. There was air refuelers, electronic warfare aircraft, and what I mentioned yesterday, AB-CCC, Airborne Combat Control Center. but there's a lot of airplanes that participated. Later on, and not too much later on, the B-52s got involved. And they would go over there and strike packages of, I think, about 3 airplanes each, carrying a load of 107 500-pound bombs, and just strike targets mainly up and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. Let's go on to the next slide. And the Ho Chi Minh Trail was one of the huge battles that was fought during the Vietnam War, and the thing went on for the entire duration of the war. We were there for about 10 years, and we fought the Battle of the Ho Chi Minh Trail the entire time. And what the Ho Chi Minh Trail was a series of trails, roads, and so forth, where the North Vietnamese would put trucks and guys on bicycles and haul supplies down through this network of roads, down through Laos, into Cambodia, and then dash across the border into South Vietnam to resupply the Viet Cong so that they could fight the Americans and the other people that were there. I've got a buddy, Toby Hughes. I showed you a picture of him yesterday right near the end. He's a musician also, but he was an F-4 pilot out of Cam Bay. And he wrote several songs about fighting the enemy along the Ho Chi Minh Trail and some of the targets that they struck up there, like Magia Pass. Magia Pass was right about here in that area, just above the DMZ. There it is, Magia Pass. And I wrote a few songs about that too. I got one called Jeb Stewart. Jeb Stewart was and in fact I'm going to sing it for you tomorrow. He was one of the fighter pilots in the squadron that I was in. But I'll save that story for tomorrow. The Alpha Day Strike Force, the way they coordinated this thing was with, well, before I get there, let me talk about how we divided up North Vietnam, the route pack system. The area of North Vietnam right down next to the DMZ, the militarized zone, was called Package 1. Right above that was Package 2, and above that was Package 3, and this then was about as far south as the surface-to-air missiles got. But there were some hot targets around then. Pack 4 had the Than Hoa Bridge in it, and I'm going to sing you a song tomorrow called Than Hoa Bridge. And it will give you some insight into the difference between the kind of bombs we dropped in Vietnam and the kind of bombs that they use today to destroy targets. Pack 6 was divided into 2 pieces. 6 Bravo was handled by the Navy, and their aircraft launched off of ships out in the Gulf of Tonkin. 6 Alpha belonged to the Air Force. And we would come up either the land side to strike targets in the Hanoi area, or come up the water side and then go westbound into where our area was. We coordinated all of the details that, yeah.
Wasn't the Than Hoa Bridge nicknamed the Dragon's Jaw?
I've never heard it called that. It may have been. I was only there for 9 months.
I've heard it was called the Dragon's Jaw because it was so hard to destroy.
The Dragon's
Jaw.
Dragon's Jaw. I'm not surprised. We expended a lot of good airplanes and munitions and pilots up there before we finally figured out how to kill him. We coordinated with a set of messages called the Snoopy. And each morning, very early in the morning, the Snoopy would be sent down to all the bases, and it would have, when it came to our base, for example, it would say, we want you guys to do the escort mission today. You will need 2 flights of 4 F-4s loaded with missiles and the 20mm gun to go up and escort the bombers. Yep.
Why was it called the Snoopy, sir?
Well, it's one of those code names that didn't really mean anything, you know. Had to call it something, you know. Yeah.
Why was the F-4 originally introduced without a gun?
Because it was built for the Navy at first, and the powers that be said to defend the fleet, if the enemy sends an airplane in close enough that you got a knife fighting with a gun, he's in too close and you probably lost the ship. So we'll build this thing that's got long-range ordnance on it, and they gave it 2 types of missiles. One was a radar-guided missile called the AIM-7 Sparrow, and the other was the AIM-9 Sidewinder, which was a heat seeker. They said, you don't really need a gun, so they didn't build one. And then later on, when the Air Force saw what good success the Navy was having with the F-4, it had many advantages. We decided to buy a trainload of those things, and so we bought them without a gun. We got smart though, and after we had the F-4, the first ones we had in the Air Force was some B models we got from the Navy. Then we had the F-4C, I got a ton of time in the F-4C. The F-4D, got a lot of time in it too. But then the F-4E was built with a nose gun in it. And it would carry, I think, about 700 or 800 rounds of 20 millimeter. The gun pods that we hung on the airplanes would carry about 1,000 rounds of 20 millimeter. Yeah.
I watched this show on the military channel about aircraft, and it said the F-4, when they first started to introduce guns on it, they couldn't fire the guns at full speed. They had to actually slow down several hundred miles an hour or something like that, just to fire the gun. Otherwise, the plane would be moving so fast it would hit the bullet before the bullet hit anything else.
Sir Isaac Newton isn't going to like this. I've heard that story too. You cannot outrun your own bullets. When the bullet comes out the muzzle of the gun, it's doing like 2,500 feet per second. And if you're doing, if you're at the speed of sound, you're only doing about 1,000 feet per second. So that bullet is going away from you at a very high rate of speed, and you ain't going to catch it.
Okay,
Not going to catch that bullet.
that's just what I heard on the show. So.
Oh, yeah, old wives' tale. You gotta watch those broadcasters, sometimes they'll lead you astray. Okay, the Alpha Day Strike Force, yeah.